Chapter 5, the Classical Era. This is where we start splitting the 150-year groups into two parts. So 1750 to 1825, a 75-year block, we call the Classical Period, Classical Era. 1825 to 1900, that's the Romantic Period, Chapter 6, which we'll get to in a while. But that together forms a nice 150-year block. We'll see if that keeps working as we move forward in history. We're still living through it, so it's hard to know right now. Perhaps more than even Chapter 4, though, this is where the foundation for modern classical music, the stuff we do most of the time in the opera house, in the concert hall, in chamber music performances, this is where a lot of it comes from. The foundation is laid in Chapter 4, are fully established and formed here in Chapter 5. As such, this is a longer chapter and it's more complex. In particular, you've got to deal with some formal structures, which I'll show you in just a moment. They're critical that you master those. This big focus on form here, really important. Some of the most important thing of the whole semester. All right, so we start off with an overview. Again, classic FM, same stuff you've come to know in the other chapters. You get some introductions to terms, the sonata, the Sonata Cycle, and the Sonata Form. Now, this is one of the things we do in classical music that is, frankly, stupid, but it's what we do. We use very similar terms in very different ways. The sonata, multi-movement work for solo piano or a work for one solo instrument, violin, flute, clarinet, whatever, with piano accompaniment. The multi-movement work part, that's what we call the Sonata Cycle. That's a structure of 3 or 4 movements. It is used here in the sonata, solo piano work or a work for one instrument, but we also use this structure almost everywhere in instrumental music in the classical period. And it really comes from the Baroque period, which I'll show you in just a moment. And then we have this multi-movement work. The first movement is almost always something we call Sonata Form. You got to have 3 things to have it: exposition, development, recapitulation. If you don't, you ain't got a sonata form. So you can see they're all 3 closely related, but they mean different things. You have a focus on form. Very important. Here's the Sonata Cycle. Here's a table. Memorize the whole thing. It will serve you well. You have a fast first movement. It's always in sonata form. Here's the tempo, allegro, fast. The second movement can be in sonata form, rondo, theme and variation, simple 3-part form, lots of different options here. The tempo is the key. Slow, slower, slowest. Then we have a third movement, a minuet and trio. That's Haydn, Beethoven. Later, Haydn and Mozart, sorry. Later, Beethoven comes along and he speeds it up. He calls his a scherzo. And you'll get into the complexities of why he did that and what makes Beethoven Beethoven. Look at the tempos, medium fast to fast. And then a fourth movement, really fast, fast, faster, fastest. Again, you have multiple single movement formal structures that it can be. A fast first movement, a slow second movement, a medium to medium fast dancey movement, a dance style, minuet or scherzo, and a really fast dramatic fourth movement. If we do a 3-movement structure, it's this one. It's the third movement that we don't do. That's the one we skip. So it becomes first, second, and what we have listed here as fourth becomes the third movement. For example, almost every concerto is a 3-movement structure. It's a fast first movement, sonata form, a slow second movement, any one of these formal structures, and a really fast dramatic last movement. There you go. And we skip this stuff. You'll get into it more as you study it in class. So that first chart deals with multiple movements, the Sonata Cycle. The most important, as you can see, of the single movement forms is the Sonata Form. We used to, years ago, call it Sonata Allegro Form, but that didn't work if you use it in the second movement because it's slow, it ain't Allegro. So we just call it Sonata Form now. It can happen in the first, second, or last movements. So here we start explaining individual forms. Single movement forms. Like I said, you've got to have an exposition, a development, and a recapitulation. And again, here's a chart. Here's a chart for the single movement sonata form. It's the most important thing you can learn in this section. This chart and the one above it, that's what you got to know. The other movement forms are interesting, but they're less important. You need to learn them, though. The rondo form comes in two types, 5 and 7 part. Minuet, trio, scherzo, and trio. We deal with issues of that. Different formal structures. Theme and variation, pretty much what it says it is. Write a theme, make some variations on it. Sonata rondo is a hybrid form. It's the most complex. We don't spend a lot of time with them. Mozart loved them. But you never know what it's going to be. It keeps changing. It's kind of a moving target. It draws, obviously, from both the sonata form and the rondo form, kind of mashes them together. That's a lot to take in. Spend some time with it because it's critical to your learning from now right through the end of the semester. Then we look at some transitional dudes, two children of J.S. Bach, C.P.E. Bach, and Johann Christian Bach, sometimes known as the London Bach. Some of your professors will play some of their music. If they don't, by all means, go online. There's a ton of it, and it's lovely music, and I personally think it gets overlooked quite a bit. Johann Stamitz, kind of the father of the modern symphony orchestra. He has a much larger group in a place called Mannheim, and he establishes a larger group with very specific techniques, and his orchestral writing lays the foundation for Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, and we normally say them in that order. Then you have Franz Benda. I picked Benda because I love his early symphonies. Again, I think they're overlooked. They're transitional, and they're viewed as kind of inferior to Haydn or Mozart or Beethoven. Well, okay, they're not as hip. They're not as complex, but they're lovely pieces of music. They just haven't moved as far historically along the track. But without him, those dudes wouldn't have done the same thing. So you have one of his early symphonies. The first movement is a sonata form, except it doesn't really have a development. You'll learn all about that. Gluck. We do go through some transformations with opera. Opera reform, very important. We talk about him here. And then we get to the three big dudes, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven. Haydn, the father of the symphony, the father of the string quartet. And we'll look at a lot of different things that make him special, both instrumental music, his string quartet. I've got one of his most famous ones here. His symphony writing, like the theme and variations in the second movement of the quote-unquote surprise symphony. You have that here as music. And then I don't have any of his vocal music for listening, but I can recommend it to you highly. His oratorios, the Lord Nelson Mass, there's some cool stuff that he wrote, which is great. Haydn naturally leads us to Mozart, which is kind of like the high point of the classical period, the classical ideal, if you will. Brilliant as both an opera composer and an instrumental composer. You have a really interesting historical document by a guy named Daines Barrington, who traveled from England to see the young Mozart for himself, and he writes back to England to tell the story of the young Mozart, and he really was a genius. It's pretty fascinating reading for its time. And then we get into the music. Symphony number 40, it's a Birds playing some Mozart, probably the most famous symphonic theme of all time, other than da-da-da-da, which we'll get to in just a little bit. You have it here, and again, use these time codes. As you play the music, follow along. You'll see the exposition. You'll see the repeat of the exposition. You'll see the development, the recapitulation. The time codes will clue you in as to what you're hearing, and you'll get to where you hear the themes, too. This is more of that active listening stuff we've been talking about. Here's a lovely little minuet and trio. Got a good example of that. And concerto. Here's a focus on form of the solo concerto. In particular, there are two big differences in the classical period. The double exposition and the cadenza. Make sure you learn this with care. It's on almost everybody's test. You have a great example. It's his Concerto number 23, one of his most famous piano concertos. This is a lovely performance on a modern instrument, but the orchestra's the right size, and we talk some in the listening guide about authentic performance practice, which is becoming more and more important in the world of classical music. So a lot of these listening guides address that. This is a good one to study that on. Then we get into opera. You've got some examples from Marriage of Figaro. We talk a little bit about the Requiem Mass. Now, we've talked about Kyrie, Gloria, Creator, Sanctus, Agnus Dei. But what we haven't talked about is that there are other Mass settings, and one in particular that's important is the Requiem Mass, the Mass for the dead. It uses a different series of propers and ordinaries, but composers, like the regular Mass, start setting those ordinary sections of the Requiem Mass. And Mozart's is one of the most famous early ones. If two movements from it here in the book, they're both absolutely beautiful. Keep an eye on these, though, because as we move forward, particularly in the Romantic period, more and more composers will focus on Requiem settings, which is really critical. Then we get to Beethoven. Now, Beethoven is presented here in Chapter 5 in the classical period. The truth is, Beethoven very much starts as a classical composer, but he is considered transitional. A lot of his music is looking forward to the next period in music, Romanticism and Romantic music. And that deals with the way he wrote, that deals with how big his pieces are, the scope he wrote with, but it also deals with him personally. Haydn is a servant for Prince Esterhazy. Mozart starts as a servant to the the Archbishop of Salzburg, but then he makes his way to Vienna. He wanted to serve in Emperor Joseph II's court, didn't get the gig, and so he kind of leaves that patronage system, becomes more of an independent musician. Beethoven was different. Beethoven never wanted to be anybody's servant, and his music is more fiercely independent because of it. And we're going to see Romantic composers sort of pick up that mantle in the next chapter, and it's all built on Beethoven. You have just a couple of gorgeous Beethoven examples, the Pathetique Sonata, and you've got the entire work, and you also have the first movement of the Fifth Symphony, arguably the most famous piece of all time. I should also mention this historical document, the Heiligenstadt Testament. This was discovered after Beethoven's death, and it's actually something of a suicide note. As Beethoven was going deaf, he was really struggling with his deafness because he was a piano performer. That was his real gig, composing more and more for himself. But as he began to lose his hearing, he lost the ability to be a public performer, and it really changed his career direction. For a time, he considered ending it all. Now, we tend to today ascribe a lot of importance to this testament because it's a suicide note where he decided to be a composer instead and not kill himself. And a lot of people point to this as the beginning of his romantic tendencies. I think we tend to put too much emphasis on it right now, to be truthful, but it's a fascinating historical document. Take the time to read it. Lots of great links to movies, websites, all kind of cool stuff here for Beethoven. Again, the Pathetique Sonata, you've got all three movements. This is Ivan Morovic, one of the greatest pianists of all time, I think overlooked. He takes more time, allows the music to evolve more, and then he plays with more dramatic flair than you'll hear from a lot of pianists. He takes a lot of chances, and it really shows in his playing. Absolutely beautiful playing. And then again, the Fifth Symphony. Beethoven's symphonies are very much transitional. The first two are truly classical. When you get to Symphony 3, the Eroica Symphony, we're looking toward the Romantic period. By the time we get to this one, da 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 da, da 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 da, right? I mean, the four most famous notes of all time. Well, that's supposed to be fate knocking at the door. Dee 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 da. And there's no program, there's no story to the symphony, but there is. There absolutely was. And you can read all about that. This is a great chamber orchestra from Sweden. You can hear a lot of different performances of this piece, of course. Some of you will also get to experience a guy named P.D.Q. Bach, his real name is Peter Schickley, doing a comedy version of this, which is hilariously funny, but actually does a great job of showing you exposition, development, recapitulation, and where Beethoven goes awry, where he, quote unquote, breaks the rules, which is really cool. We end up with a discussion about the piano concertos, his one opera, Fidelio, and the Missa Solemnis, the Solemn Mass. He did two Mass settings. The first one in C major is actually overlooked. It doesn't get performed near enough. But then the Solemn Mass is massive, massive Mass. It's a really big, dramatic piece. Of course, not for the church, for the concert hall. But it's that same thing. It's let's do the setting of 5 movements of the unchanging Mass ordinary, taking that challenge of taking that same text we've been using for well over 1,000 years now, coming up with something new musically to say. A lot of what's here really ought to be in Chapter 6. We keep him here in Chapter 5 because he certainly starts as a classical composer, but he's laying the foundation for Chapter 6, which is coming up next.